Hey, are you a notorious war criminal, profiteered off the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, initiated the widespread use of torture, and kickstarted a new era of mass surveillance of American citizens? Well, if so, buddy, let me tell you, you are gonna love the new Democratic candidate for president.
One surprising endorsement, because on Friday, Dick Cheney said he will vote for Kamala Harris. Well.
Wow. Do you maybe not want to be politically aligned with torture and surveillance happy war criminals? Well, seriously, get over yourself, okay? It's not just about you, because the Democratic Party is the party of unity for all Americans, including ones who shot their friend in the face.
Vice President Dick Cheney shot his hunting buddy in the face.
Because along with Bush's #1 shooter and 17 former Reagan staffers, Kamala Harris has been racking up Republican endorsements. And as her speech at the DNC made very clear, she relishes this broad appeal while celebrating our shared affinity as Americans. You know, she speaks to
every American, regardless of party, race, gender, or the language your grandmother speaks.
And she uses the example of crime to argue that
we are all in this together.
But are we? You know, like it or not, the folks perpetrating crime in Harris's analogy exist outside the us being invoked. You know, she makes the limits of us clear when she says that Trump only represents billionaires.
My new Trump watches. We're doing quite a number with watches, and the quality to me is very important. Get your Trump watch right now.
And foreign interest rather than, you know, real people like the middle class.
Trump tax that would raise prices on middle-class families by almost $4,000 a year.
So for all its apparent universality, the mantra "we're all in this together" has some pretty firm limits. Now, maybe you think that it's okay to view criminals as separate from the nation as a whole. But this paradigm reveals that the nation being discussed isn't defined by the simple reality of who lives within its borders, but rather that it's ideologically constructed. Which basically means the nation isn't just like a physical thing that exists, it's an idea that someone's come up with and then sort of put over reality to help us understand it. Now, if constructing a nation is an ideological project, we then gotta ask, well, what and who is this project for? So today, we're gonna look at how the nation, specifically the US, but this applies across the board, is constructed through political speech. We're gonna look at who is included, who is excluded, and what's obscured when we're told,
I promise to be a president for all Americans.
And we're gonna do all this with the help of Italian revolutionary and philosopher Antonio Gramsci and his theory of hegemony. We'll see how constructing a shared ideal of the nation co-ops subversive movements and produces some pretty scary authoritarian tendencies. You know, because getting kids to pledge allegiance to the flag every day isn't just a weird little quirk, but is a strategy which ensures we all feel part of one shared endeavor. Okay, before we keep going, I want to pause and take a look at an article titled "Harris Floats America Forward Tax Credits to Help Finance Manufacturing Revival." Now, when we look at any coverage about policy issues, it's so important to consider how what's being reported differs from what the person actually said. And so many news organizations these days are prioritizing clicks and views over accurate information. This can lead to a focus on sensational stories and not substantive discussions. And that's why I've been so excited to use Ground News. Now, if you haven't heard of it yet, Ground News is a website and an app that empowers you to navigate our complex media landscape. They aggregate articles from over 50,000 news sources around the world and across the political spectrum, and it allows you to compare headlines, see the reliability of the source, and then see where the bias leans in each article. If we go back to the article I mentioned, we see the story's been covered by more than 84 sources, and we see where all the sources' biases lean on the bias distribution chart. We also have the factuality rating, which shows us the reporting practices of a news publication based on the average score of 3 different rating systems, and then you see who owns each source over here on the ownership chart. All these factors influence framing and help you compare the biases of different news organizations and how these biases affect their coverage of a given topic. My favorite feature is the My News Bias feature. It shows an in-depth report on what I'm consuming, what sources I read the most, bias breakdowns, factuality distribution, who owns what media sources. Honestly, these charts have been so helpful for helping me sort of be aware of my own biases, pushing me to break out of my echo chamber. Now, if you want to check it all out for yourself, you can go to ground.news/wisecrack and give it a try. And when you sign up through my link, you're gonna get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use to get unlimited access to all of these features. I think Ground News is doing important work, especially right now during an election season, and I think you should check them out as well. For now, let's get back to talking about how nations get constructed. Now, while imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime until his death, Antonio Gramsci wrote extensively, both on his unorthodox Marxist theories of the state and society and also the concept of hegemony. Now, his work was never completed and published in a systematic way because he was in prison and stuff. So his concepts are often misunderstood and sometimes get co-opted. So we're going to try to get this right, which is why we brought in our friend John Duncan to help write this script. So if it's good, thanks, John. If it's wrong, it's not my fault. Blame him. The Scottish are sometimes liars and tricksters, and I might have fallen for his charms. Also subscribe to his channel. There's a link in the description. Now, hegemony is the notion that society, and specifically the state, is constructed under capitalism as a manifestation of the general interest of the ruling class. Now, in other words, this means our societies are structured to serve the interest of the most powerful members, not the majority. So when Harris constructs a hegemonic ideal of the American nation, she isn't actually prioritizing the general interest of society, our interest. Rather, she's expressing the interest of the dominant class. Now, this doesn't mean that hegemony only acts in the short-term, immediate interest of big businesses and oil companies, because if it did, we wouldn't have stuff like labor laws or environmental regulations. Instead, maintaining hegemony allows the ruling class as a whole to maintain its power. Now, Gramsci argues that the nation-state is destined to create favorable conditions for the ruling class's maximum expansion. But the development and expansion of that particular group are conceived of and presented as being the motor force of universal expansion, of a development of all the national energies. He's saying that the state doesn't straight up tell us that it's maintaining the conditions for the ruling class to thrive. Instead, it presents this aim as one shared, universal, national project. In other words, a political project that serves the interest of the ruling classes is repackaged as one that's best for everyone. And this is not only done with political speech. Imagine being at a work meeting and your boss is like, hey team, hey family, hey buddies, hey guys. We're all gonna have to make some sacrifices to work towards the goals of profitability, and we might have to work some late nights and not get that raise you were hoping for, and little Timmy might not get those braces, but we're in this together, and he's not in it together with you. It's like that. Other times though, hegemonic forces squash any opposition, and most often it's maintained by a combination of co-option and smashing, or as Gramsci puts it, coercion and consent. We see this in the creation of welfare states in both Europe and New Deal America. Both benefited the working classes and arose after significant working class struggle. But by providing some concessions to the working class and alleviating some of the poverty and misery produced by capitalist exploitation, the hegemonic nation state could buy off radical movements and encourage the working class to buy into the state. Now, the state is legitimized through its acts of benevolence, whether that's welfare or healthcare. And who could even imagine wanting to do a revolution when the workers and the CEOs are all happy, happy together, snuggling up, having the best time. Some even argue that the New Deal actually saved the US from falling to socialism. And it's not that progress is fake or that improvement is impossible, but that such improvements can be used to both justify and obscure that the underlying system remains perfectly intact. The benefits of such welfare regimes were not, however, extended to all of the people. The New Deal excluded Black and Indigenous people from many programs and helped cement racial inequalities, according to author Justin Potter. Now, similarly, UK welfare regimes kept male breadwinners as the head of the household. Concessions to certain parts of the population, white men, not only co-opted potential revolutionary challenges, but actually upheld racism and patriarchy. Unions in the UK have at times opposed paying welfare directly to women because it would undermine the breadwinner status of the male head of the household. But these welfare regimes still get folded into a state mythology which frames the nation as a benevolent actor, serving all of its citizens. Biden's agenda is often compared to the New Deal and treated as proof of his support for working class people. He's also been dubbed the most pro-union president in history, and that's despite working with Congress to deny the rail worker union the right to strike and then strong-arming them into agreeing to a contract that met few of their demands. Now, the sad thing is, despite all of that, he probably still is the most pro-union president in history, which tells you something about the ideological construction of the American presidency and who they're maybe serving. But more on that now. Now in the UK, the Labour Party proudly reminds us that it founded the NHS as evidence that it acts on behalf of the people despite their current work to erode the British healthcare system. Now in her DNC speech, Harris referenced the formative childhood experience of learning about civil rights leaders. This is another example of how subversive movements are co-opted and mythologized by hegemony. Because the civil rights movement was, of course, incredibly important. Its hard-won victories were essential for improving the conditions of black folks in America. But these victories were won via mass civil disobedience and struggle in the streets, not just in courtroom battles, as Harris seems to imply.
Those who battled in the courtroom to make real the promise of America.
And the civil rights movement, of course, didn't destroy white supremacy in America. Instead, the state took its demands and expressed them as what Gramsci called the development of all the national energies. We can't possibly be racist, right? But while granting that civil rights ended what was functionally legal apartheid, the racist structures essential to protecting the ruling class didn't just magically vanish. They morphed into other policies like mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and the massive expansion of police power. This all helped maintain the white supremacist capitalist state.
The war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States on the heels of the civil rights movement.
Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was, for a time, placated, and its revolutionary potential defanged.
So this record is in honor of George Floyd.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
But let's just imagine, what if instead of incorporating some of the movement's demands into policies like the Civil Rights Act of 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson just told the civil rights movement, hey, you can suck my last name and keep it moving, folks. Now, would it have become increasingly militant and powerful, posing an even bigger threat to hegemony? I can't know for sure, but maybe? As historian C.L.R. James recounts in The Black Jacobins, early on in the Haitian slave revolt, black leaders attempted to make peace with the enslavers by offering to lead the revolutionaries back to slavery in exchange for the freedom of 400 leaders and no reprimands for the enslaved. This could have been a moment of hegemonic co-option and progress to maintain the slave state, but the enslavers refused, and in doing so spurned the Haitian leader Toussaint Louverture to pursue nothing less than complete liberty for all and the complete destruction of the slave state. Now, in contrast to the enslavers of Haiti, when the U.S. state was confronted with the growing power of the American civil rights movement, it decided to compromise. The movement won and civil rights were granted, and it became part of
the promise of America.
Racism is presented as a blip on the road towards the current real promise of America, rather than a historic and ongoing reality, one that benefits the ruling class. Okay, so hopefully now we understand hegemony and how it can co-opt progressive projects to serve the state. So let's return to Harris's DNC speech and see how she constructs the image of a shared national project. Harris notes she's accepting the Democratic presidential nomination on behalf of a whole laundry list of Americans. In doing this, she's constructing a people and a shared national project in which all these people can live out their own destinies. And she's presenting the hegemon, personified here in the presidency, as acting on behalf of all the people, rather than just maintaining the underlying system. Now, she creates an idea that those various groups, some of whom have wildly different political interests, all share one vision. Black Americans and white Americans, men, women, Republicans, Democrats, are all understood as legitimate members of society. And despite their differences, they all want
to chart a new way forward. Not as members of any one party or faction, but as Americans.
It doesn't matter that these groups have conflicting interests and commitments. They can still be collected within a single political community.
We may have set a record for how many Republicans spoke at our Democratic National Convention.
This evokes the ideal of a community bound by one shared national energy and recreates a mythic ideal where the state will act in those shared interests, including politically and philosophically dubious ideals like the rule of law. It can seem contradictory to support both the civil rights movement and the rule of law when the rule was the very thing being contested. That didn't make sense. What I'm saying is the civil rights movement was trying to change laws, like laws that existed that were just straight up racist, you know? So to do the civil rights thing, they had to say, hey, rule of law, you're bad. And the rule of law was like, oh, we're gonna like beat you in the street and put hoses on you and send dogs on you. And they were like, can you not? And then they were like, oh, I guess not. But consistency doesn't matter, you know, when the point is to reinforce the idea that any member of this unified nation, whether or not they're oppressed by the rule of law, has a stake in maintaining that ideal. You know, here it's just textbook hegemonic co-option. Similarly, when Harris says she will bring together labor, workers, small business owners, entrepreneurs, American companies to create an opportunity economy where everyone has a chance to compete and a chance to succeed, she again creates a shared national project amongst groups with contradictory interest. And this exposes the paradoxes that Harris, and most politicians, to be fair, are trying to obscure. It's obvious that the interest of labor and the interest of business owners are directly opposed. I mean, think about it this way, like, do you think that you and your boss have the same interest? You know, is what's good for your boss and their company good for you? And is what's good for you good for your boss and the company's bottom line? Probably not, because business owners want to profit and labor wants livable wages. And since the dawn of neoliberalism, labor's share of income has declined dramatically, while inequality has spiked. Yet here we have Harris creating an ideal where workers and capital share the same interest, obfuscating the reality that capital will always extract as much from labor as possible. This is a sort of mythological world where business and workers are on an even playing field with one shared goal. And to be clear, she's far from the first to do this. We're using her as an example because this is recent, but they all do this. All of the politicians on all the sides have been doing this stuff, Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair used similar rhetoric back in 1996.
Forget the past. No more bosses versus workers. We are on the same side, the same team, and Britain United will win.
And in both cases, the aim is the co-option of potentially subversive tendencies, like those of organized labor, by rallying our shared national energies. As a final example, we can see how Harris creates an insider-outsider dynamic. Now, we've seen her exclude criminals from being part of the nation, but consistent with right-wing figures like Senor Trump, Harris uses speech like,
I reject the false choice. I reject the false choice that suggests we must either choose between securing our border or creating a system of immigration that is safe, orderly, and humane. We can and we must do both.
This plays off of America's mythology as a melting pot. Anyone with enough gumption can succeed and contribute to our collective success, while excluding those who are illegal. And this language supports hard border politics, which, if you remember our previous video on borders, can then reproduce systemic racism. This reveals another effect of universalizing political language. Some people will always necessarily fall outside of the nation, which means either being ignored by hegemony or directly attacked as a threat. Okay, at this point you might be thinking, wow, Michael, a politician that's sort of full of shit. This is shocking. Okay, but what if it isn't just stymieing our ability to fight the system, but is actively endangering people within and outside of the nation? Because the way that Harris constructs the nation seems to flirt with authoritarian tendencies. When she calls for the inclusion of legal immigrants as fully American, she creates a pathway of acceptance into a universal category. And this can recall the work of philosopher Frantz Fanon, specifically his book, Black Skin, White Masks. Now, in that book, Fanon recounts being forced to abandon his native Creole French to achieve recognition by white French colonizers. Through forced inclusion into the hegemonic language, the very humanity of black colonized subjects is subordinated to the ideal of white Frenchness. Now, when Harris places a conditionality on the humanity of immigrants, it sort of suggests that they have to earn their place in the country, that their humanity is dependent on becoming fully American. This also reinforces the conditional humanity of those who exist outside the nation when her support for militarized borders is accompanied by a call to make America's military
the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world.
Now, the implication with all this is that we need to protect America, as our people are the most legitimate of humans, and that those who are excluded become a sort of inhuman threat to be dealt with. By this logic, it's better to be oppressed within the state than to not be American. From a slightly different perspective, there's another condition placed on inclusion within the nation by this logic. When Harris argues that she will serve the middle class by creating an opportunity economy, she's not only universalizing the contradictory interest of capital and labor, but is also playing on some deeply embedded neoliberal ideals. Ideas like, to be a legit American, well then you gotta compete in the marketplace. And to be clear, this idea is not new. It's been there for decades and decades. It's used by the leaders of all the political parties. We're talking about Harris because she's the current candidate for the Democrats, but like, not a new thing. She didn't invent this. Because our mythology has long fetishized the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. You know, competition and the free market are as American as apple pie and backing fascist coups in Latin America. But with neoliberalism, it all gets supercharged. You know, those who fail to compete are failing the national project and have to be punished. Welfare recipients who fail in this way have long been dehumanized in racialized and gendered ways. The collective nightmare of the racialized welfare queen still looms over US politics and is used to justify cuts in social services. This rhetoric has justified America's long history of forcing welfare recipients into work and punishing them if they remain unemployed. Both of these cases, we see the dark side of universalist and inclusive language. Inclusion within the hegemonic nation is always predicated on the co-option of those who might threaten cohesion, and the exclusion of those who can't be co-opted. You know, it may even be the case that the more inclusive the national myth appears, the more dejected and inhuman those who are excluded from it appear. They are shadows and threats that can only be punished or destroyed. But wait, there's a positive side here. I promise you that it's not all doom and gloom. One essential element of Gramsci's theory of hegemony is that its contradictions always lead to the development of new forms of counter-hegemony. You know, basically saying that like the system as it is, those contradictions produce forms of resistance to the system. And you know, we've all seen the increasing contradictions at the heart of this American myth. And once you see the false universalism, brother, it's hard to unsee. Racist bordering and policing, the super profits of corporations, the impoverishment of the average person, the continued domination of indigenous peoples, all reveal that Lady Liberty is a liar. And the more obvious the hypocrisy, the harder it is to co-opt resistance. And if Fanon is right, this can even mean the emergence of new types of humanity. You know, a sort of humanism that is truly universal, and in which politics serves the interest of everyone, not just the interest of the most powerful. But what do you think? Is America as inclusive as an Ivy League secret society, or are politicians honestly just trying their best in a broken system? Please let us know in the comments. A huge shout out to all of our patrons. If you want to support our channel and get videos early without ads, plus extra audio and video content, there's a link in the description. Please leave a comment, like, subscribe. It all helps us so much and allows us to keep making videos just like this. In the meantime, pat yourself on the back because you watched a whole YouTube video today, and that means something. I'll see you next time.